November 20th, 1943, Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. Just after dawn, the lagoon lies deceptively calm. Smoke from the naval bombardment drifts low over the palm trees, blurring the outlines of concrete bunkers carved into the sand. Offshore, rows of American landing craft idle in the water, their engines vibrating beneath decks crowded with Marines, weighed down by rifles, packs, and ammunition. Many expect resistance. Few expect what waits beneath the surface. As the first wave moves forward, boats slow abruptly. Coral reefs rise where planners believed deep water would be. Ramps drop hundreds of yards from shore. Marines step into the lagoon and begin to wade, water climbing from knees to chests. Then the firing starts. Machine guns open from positions thought destroyed. Mortar rounds walk across the reef. The beach ahead erupts in splashes and smoke. Japanese officers had predicted this island would take weeks to seize. Within minutes, that certainty begins to fracture. By late 1943, the Pacific War had entered a decisive phase. Japan's rapid expansion across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific in 1941 and 1942 had reached its outer limits. Midway had shattered the Imperial Navy's offensive power. Guadalcanal had exposed the vulnerability of Japanese supply lines. Yet, despite these reverses, Japanese planners remained confident in one belief, that small, heavily fortified islands could bleed an attacker white and force a negotiated peace. This confidence rested on experience. At Wake Island in December 1941, a small Japanese landing force had been repulsed by determined defenders. Throughout 1942, island fighting in New Guinea and the Solomons had demonstrated how terrain, climate, and prepared positions could neutralize numerical superiority. By 1943, Japanese doctrine emphasized defense in depth, interlocking fields of fire, reinforced concrete bunkers, and artillery positioned to cover beaches and reefs rather than retreat inland. Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands became a test case for this strategy. Betio Island, the atoll's southern anchor, was barely 2 miles long and less than half a mile wide. It offered no room to maneuver. Every approach could be observed. Every landing zone could be pre-sighted. To Japanese planners, this was an advantage, not a liability. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, commanding the garrison, oversaw the construction of one of the most formidable island defenses yet attempted. Seawalls were reinforced. Coconut logs and steel rails were embedded into the sand. Concrete pillboxes were sunk deep enough to survive naval gunfire. Coastal guns, salvaged from British warships, were positioned to fire directly into the lagoon. More than 4,500 defenders, naval troops, construction units, and elite special naval landing forces were ordered to fight to the last. Shibasaki was explicit in his confidence. Reports sent up the chain of command stated that it would take 100 years for the Americans to capture Tarawa. The logic was simple. No force could cross the exposed reefs under fire, sustain the losses, and maintain momentum. Even if landings succeeded, the defenders could withdraw into hardened positions and attrit the attackers indefinitely. By late 1943, the Pacific War represented something entirely different. It was not an end in itself, but a gateway. The Gilbert Islands lay astride the Central Pacific route toward the Marshalls, the Marianas, and eventually Japan itself. For Admiral Chester Nimitz, seizing Tarawa would prove whether large-scale amphibious assaults against fortified islands were viable or catastrophically flawed. As both sides prepared, they were drawing lessons from entirely different wars. American planners approached Tarawa with a mixture of caution and confidence shaped by recent experience. Guadalcanal had proven that the United States could seize and hold a hostile island against determined resistance. Massive industrial output now allowed for sustained operations across vast distances. Carrier task forces, battleships, and specialized amphibious units could be assembled with a speed Japan could no longer match. On paper, Tarawa appeared to be a limited objective. small, isolated, and vulnerable to overwhelming firepower. Operation Galvanic, approved in mid-1943, was designed as a controlled test of this new approach. The assault would combine prolonged naval bombardment, carrier-based airstrikes, and a tightly scheduled landing by the 2nd Marine Division. The island's small size led planners to believe that defenders could be neutralized before the first wave reached shore. The assumption was not that Tarawa would be easy, but that resistance would be disorganized and short-lived once American forces landed. This confidence centered on firepower. Battleships and cruisers would hammer Betio for hours. Carrier aircraft would strafe and bomb visible positions. Intelligence estimates suggested that Japanese defenses, though extensive, would not survive sustained bombardment. Planners expected shattered fortifications and demoralized defenders by the time Marines crossed the lagoon. Critical details, however, remained imperfectly understood. The coral reef surrounding Betio formed a natural barrier extending hundreds of yards from shore. While tide tables were consulted, planners relied on incomplete hydrographic surveys conducted before the war. They assumed high tide would provide enough water for landing craft to clear the reef. In reality, tidal conditions in the lagoon were more complex and lower than predicted on the morning of the assault. The invasion force itself reflected both innovation and limitation. Tracked amphibious vehicles, Amtraks, were assigned to carry initial waves across the reef, but there were not enough of them. Later waves would rely on Higgins boats, which could not cross shallow coral. The plan assumed speed, get ashore quickly, overwhelm resistance, and expand the beachhead before defenders could react. Japanese intelligence, meanwhile, interpreted American movements through a different lens. The buildup of naval power was visible, but Japanese officers believed that even a powerful fleet could not solve the fundamental problem of landing under fire. Their doctrine emphasized that the killing would happen in the water, not on the beach. If the first waves were destroyed, the assault would stall. Time favored the defender. Both sides entered the battle with confidence rooted in logic and blind spots shaped by assumption. American planners trusted technology and schedules. Japanese defenders trusted terrain and fortification. Neither fully grasped how brutally those assumptions would collide once the first ramp dropped and the lagoon filled with men under fire. As the invasion fleet closed in on Tarawa, theory was about to give way to experience, measured in yards, minutes, and lives. The first Marines into the lagoon experienced Tarawa not as a battlefield, but as a problem that had no immediate solution. The water was too deep to run, too shallow to swim. Rifles and radios were held overhead as men leaned forward into machine gun fire that had survived the bombardment almost untouched. Concrete bunkers, buried deeper than anticipated, reopened their firing slits within minutes. The sound was not chaotic, it was methodical. Japanese gunners fired in short, disciplined bursts, conserving ammunition and tracking movement across the reef with practiced precision. Inside those bunkers, the defenders saw exactly what they had planned for. The reef functioned as a killing zone, forcing attackers into narrow approaches with no cover and no speed. Mortars were adjusted by sound and splash. Heavy machine guns raked the waterline where Marines struggled forward, exposed for hundreds of yards. The defenders were not improvising. They were executing a system rehearsed and refined over months of preparation. Every firing position was designed to support another, overlapping arcs so that no single bunker could be isolated quickly. For the Marines, the assumptions that had shaped training dissolved under the weight of immediate survival. Naval gunfire had lifted on schedule, but the enemy had not been erased. Communications broke down as radios filled with water or were lost with their operators. Officers and non-commissioned leaders began to fall in the first minutes, forcing decisions onto junior Marines who had no map of the beach ahead, only fragments of shattered coral and the direction of incoming fire. Momentum, the central requirement of amphibious doctrine, slowed to a crawl. Technology, expected to bridge the gap between sea and shore, proved uneven. Amphibious tractors that reached the beach became lifelines, offering moving cover and a way to deliver heavy weapons forward. Yet many were destroyed almost immediately by well-placed artillery and anti-boat fire. Tanks that managed to land found themselves restricted by soft sand and debris, their movement predictable to defenders who had pre-registered firing points. Flamethrowers and demolition charges became decisive tools, not because they were planned as such, but because nothing else could dislodge defenders buried beneath layers of reinforced concrete and earth. Leadership emerged under conditions that offered no time for command conferences or formal coordination. Decisions were made by proximity rather than rank. Small groups formed around whoever was still standing and moving forward. Progress was measured in yards gained, bunkers silenced, and wounded evacuated. Casualties accumulated not in dramatic surges, but in a steady, grinding rhythm that exhausted both body and will. The beachhead did not expand cleanly. It crept forward through smoke, heat, and relentless noise. For the Japanese defenders, the early hours confirmed long-held expectations. The landing was costly. The reef had done its work, but the battle did not end at the waterline. As Marines reached the seawall and pushed inland, the nature of the fight began to change. Close-range combat replaced long fields of fire. Communications between bunkers grew uncertain as bombardment resumed and smoke obscured signals. Ammunition had been stockpiled, but resupply under constant pressure became impossible. The defensive system, formidable from a distance, began to fragment under direct assault. What neither side had anticipated was the endurance required to sustain this kind of fighting without pause. There would be no relief, no withdrawal, and no safe rear area. As daylight burned away and the lagoon filled with wrecked craft and bodies, the battle settled into a brutal equilibrium. Tarawa was no longer about whether the island could be taken slowly or quickly. It had become a test of whether either side could continue at all. The second day at Tarawa began without the clarity of a fresh assault or the relief of a pause. It arrived as a continuation of noise, of exhaustion, of unfinished work. Along the narrow strip of Batio, Marines who had survived the first day rose from shallow scrapes in the sand or from behind the shattered remains of seawalls, unsure how many others were still alive to their left or right. The beachhead existed, but only in fragments, connected by movement rather than control. As pressure increased, the character of the fighting shifted. Japanese positions that had dominated the reef were now bypassed or attacked from angles never intended in their design. Flamethrower teams moved forward under covering fire, forcing defenders out of sealed bunkers or killing them where they stood. Demolition charges collapsed firing slits and entrances, turning concrete advantages into traps. Each advance was localized and costly, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. The defensive network, built to stop a landing, was being dismantled piece by men operating without any illusion of safety. Japanese officers faced a reality they had not anticipated. The assumption that losses in the water would halt the assault proved incorrect. Even after devastating casualties, the attackers did not withdraw. Instead, they reorganized on the move, pressing inland with a persistence that undermined the logic of attritional defense. Communication between defensive sectors deteriorated as command posts were destroyed and runners failed to return. Coordination gave way to isolated resistance, each bunker fighting independently, cut off from the broader situation. American leadership adapted under fire in ways that formal doctrine had not predicted. Battalion plans became irrelevant within hours. Initiative flowed downward, relying on individuals who could recognize opportunities and exploit them immediately. Tanks, when available, were used as mobile shields rather than breakthrough weapons. Naval gunfire was called in at dangerously close ranges, collapsing Japanese positions just ahead of advancing Marines. The boundary between land and sea blurred as destroyers moved in close enough to fire directly onto the island. Psychological strain mounted on both sides. For the Marines, the proximity of the enemy erased any sense of distance or abstraction. Combat was face-to-face, measured in seconds and yards, with no clear front line. For Japanese defenders, the promise of holding indefinitely began to erode as ammunition ran low and escape routes disappeared. The expectation of a slow, methodical defense gave way to a recognition that the fight had become one of survival without reinforcement or relief. By the end of the second day, the outcome was no longer in doubt, but the cost was still unfolding. Resistance continued in pockets, each requiring time and lives to overcome. Tarawa was being taken not through a decisive breakthrough, but through relentless pressure applied everywhere at once. The island was shrinking under American control, and with it, the space in which the defenders could continue to fight. What remained would not be resolved by maneuver or planning, but by final, irreversible decisions made under the weight of exhaustion and inevitability. The final phase of the battle did not announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It emerged gradually, as resistance thinned and the sounds of organized fire gave way to scattered bursts and sudden explosions. By the morning of November 22, the shape of the fight had changed. The Marines were no longer attempting to establish a foothold. They were advancing deliberately across an island that was running out of depth, methodically clearing positions that had been designed to stop them at the water's edge. What remained of the Japanese command structure had fractured. Admiral Shibasaki had been killed early in the battle, his command post destroyed by naval gunfire. Without centralized coordination, defensive efforts devolved into isolated stands. Small groups continued to fight from bunkers, trenches, and shell craters, often refusing surrender even when surrounded. The logic of the original defensive plan, delay, attrition, and endurance, could no longer function without cohesion. American units, though severely depleted, began to synchronize their movements. Tanks moved forward in short bounds, covering infantry advances with direct fire. Engineers and assault teams followed closely, sealing bunker entrances with explosives or fire. Naval gunfire was adjusted with increasing precision as observers gained better visibility inland. The pace was slow, but it was continuous. There were no pauses long enough for the defenders to regroup. The turning point came not from a single breakthrough, but from accumulation. Every cleared position reduced Japanese fields of fire. Every destroyed bunker exposed the next. The island's narrow dimensions, once a defensive strength, now worked against those holding it. There was nowhere to withdraw, no space to absorb losses or reestablish a line. Each hour compressed the remaining defenders into smaller pockets with fewer options. By the night of November 22, organized resistance had effectively collapsed. What followed were final attacks carried out in darkness. Small, desperate charges launched against Marine lines, often involving the last available weapons. These assaults achieved little tactically, but they underscored the reality that the battle had passed beyond strategy. It had become a series of terminal encounters, each ending the same way. As dawn broke on November 23, the firing diminished. Marines moved cautiously through areas that had been killing zones days earlier. The silence was uneven, interrupted by sporadic shots from holdouts who were quickly eliminated. After 76 hours of continuous combat, Battle Island was effectively under American control. The island that Japanese officers believed could not be taken quickly had fallen in just over 3 days. The question now was not how Tarawa was captured, but what that speed had cost and what it revealed about the war that lay ahead. As the last organized resistance on Battle was extinguished, The full weight of what had occurred began to settle over the island. The fighting that followed the collapse of Japanese coordination was brief but unyielding, marked by a finality that left little room for ambiguity. Small groups of defenders emerged from ruined positions, sometimes charging, sometimes firing until ammunition was exhausted. There were no negotiations, no pauses, and no illusions left on either side. The battle ended not with surrender, but with exhaustion and annihilation. For American commanders, the realization was immediate and unsettling. Tarawa had been taken far faster than Japanese doctrine predicted, but not in the manner U.S. planners had envisioned. Speed had not reduced casualties. In many ways, it had intensified them. The compressed timeline forced units to fight continuously, without rotation or relief, amplifying fatigue and compounding losses. Victory came through persistence rather than elegance, through adaptation under fire rather than flawless execution. The decisive change was not technological or numerical, but behavioral. Marines had learned in real time how to fight a fortified island that refused to break. Assault teams coordinated instinctively. Naval and ground forces adjusted their cooperation minute by minute. Destroyers closed to within point-blank range of the shore, firing directly into bunkers that had defied heavier bombardment from farther out. The barrier between sea power and land combat dissolved under necessity. For the Japanese defenders, Tarawa revealed the limits of static defense against an enemy willing to absorb losses and continue forward regardless. The reef had worked. The fortifications had held longer than expected, but they could not compensate for isolation. Once American forces were ashore in sufficient numbers, the outcome became inevitable. There was no mechanism for counterattack, withdrawal, or reinforcement. The defensive system had been built to kill, not to recover. By the end of November 23, fewer than 24 Japanese defenders were taken alive. Over 4,600 lay dead across the island. American casualties were equally sobering. More than 1,000 Marines killed and over 2,000 wounded in less than 4 days of fighting. The lagoon and beaches bore silent witness to the cost of every assumption made before the first landing craft moved forward. Tarawa was over, but its impact was only beginning. The battle would echo far beyond the confines of a small coral island, reshaping how future assaults would be planned and how their human cost would be understood. The immediate aftermath of Tarawa unfolded in stages, not all of them visible from the island itself. As Marines secured the final sectors of Bayo, the work shifted abruptly from combat to accounting. Bodies were recovered where possible. Wounded men were evacuated across the same lagoon that had claimed so many during the assault. Equipment was gathered, counted, and redistributed. The physical island fell quiet, but the emotional and institutional shock of the battle was only beginning to spread. Within days, reports began moving up the American chain of command. Casualty figures were precise and unavoidable. In 76 hours, the 2nd Marine Division had suffered losses that rivaled or exceeded those of far longer campaigns. Commanders who had planned the operation now faced the implications of what had gone wrong and what had unexpectedly worked. Tarawa could not be dismissed as an anomaly. It had been the first fully opposed amphibious landing against a heavily fortified island in the Central Pacific. Its lessons would shape everything that followed. Public reaction in the United States marked a turning point. For the first time, graphic photographs of fallen American servicemen appeared in major newspapers and magazines. Images of bodies lying on the beach, half submerged in water, stripped away any remaining illusions about the nature of the Pacific War. The shock was deliberate. Military authorities allowed the images to circulate, believing that the public needed to understand the price being paid. The response was not panic, but resolve, tempered by a new awareness of cost. Inside the Marine Corps, Tarawa prompted immediate reassessment. Amphibious doctrine was revised with urgency. Greater emphasis was placed on accurate hydrographic reconnaissance and tidal analysis. Production of amphibious tractors was accelerated, and their role expanded beyond the initial assault waves. Naval gunfire coordination was refined, with procedures developed for closer, more responsive fire support. The assumption that bombardment alone could neutralize prepared defenses was quietly discarded. Japanese assessments, though less visible, were equally significant. Tarawa demonstrated that even the most carefully prepared island defenses could not hold indefinitely against sustained, coordinated assault. The expectation that American losses would force hesitation or withdrawal proved unfounded. Japanese planners began to reconsider the balance between coastal defense and depth inland, a shift that would influence later battles in the Marshalls, Marianas, and beyond. Yet none of these changes diminished the central reality. Tarawa had been taken, but at a cost that could not be ignored or repeated without consequence. The battle exposed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of modern amphibious warfare in stark, unforgiving terms. What Tarawa ultimately represented went beyond tactical adjustment or strategic calculation. It marked a moment when the war's true character became undeniable to those fighting it, those planning it, and those watching from afar. The longer-term consequences of Tarawa unfolded quietly, embedded in planning documents, training manuals, and the unspoken expectations of those preparing for the next landings. The island itself faded from headlines as new operations captured public attention, but its influence remained constant. Every subsequent assault in the Central Pacific carried Tarawa's imprint, whether acknowledged directly or not. In the months that followed, the United States applied Tarawa's lessons with precision. At Kwajalein and Eniwetok, landing plans incorporated deeper preliminary reconnaissance and more flexible fire support. Amphibious tractors were assigned in greater numbers, ensuring that fewer troops would be forced to wade exposed across reefs. Naval gunfire schedules became less rigid, allowing commanders to respond to resistance that survived initial bombardment rather than assuming it had been destroyed. These changes did not eliminate casualties, but they reduced the kind of catastrophic exposure seen at Batio. For the Marines who had fought there, Tarawa became a reference point, a silent standard against which later battles were measured. Veterans spoke of it not as a victory defined by maneuver or surprise, but as a test of endurance and cohesion under conditions that stripped warfare down to its most elemental form. The knowledge that such losses could occur in a matter of days reshaped expectations for future operations. There would be no easy islands. Japanese defensive doctrine also evolved, though under increasingly constrained circumstances. Recognizing that static beach defenses alone could not stop determined assaults, planners shifted toward deeper, layered positions designed to draw attackers inland and prolong resistance. This adjustment would make later battles even more costly, not less. Tarawa had not reduced suffering. It had clarified how it would be distributed. Strategically, the capture of Tarawa validated the Central Pacific Drive. The Gilbert Islands became operational bases supporting further advances toward the Marshalls and the Marianas. Airfields were expanded, supply routes secured, and the tempo of American operations accelerated. The war moved closer to Japan, not in theory, but in measurable distance and time. Yet Tarawa's most enduring impact was psychological. It forced an honest reckoning with the nature of the conflict. The Pacific War would not be won through overwhelming firepower alone, nor through assumptions about enemy collapse. It would be fought island by island, at close range, against an opponent prepared to die in place. That understanding framed everything that followed, and it shaped how Tarawa would be remembered, not as a failure or a triumph in isolation, but as a warning written in blood. Tarawa endures not because of its size or strategic value, but because it stripped modern warfare of illusion. In 76 hours, the battle exposed the limits of prediction, the cost of assumption, and the reality that technology cannot replace human endurance. Japanese officers believed time and terrain would decide the outcome. American planners believed firepower and scheduling would. Both were partly right and dangerously incomplete. What ultimately decided Tarawa was not doctrine, but persistence. Men moved forward because stopping meant dying where they stood. Decisions were made without certainty, guided only by immediate necessity. Victory came not from a single decisive action, but from countless small acts of resolve carried out under relentless pressure. The images from Batio forced the war into the public consciousness in a way statistics never could. They revealed that progress across the Pacific would be measured not in miles gained, but in lives spent. Tarawa became the moment when that truth could no longer be ignored. Yet the battle also reshaped how future sacrifices would be made. Its lessons saved lives later, even as the war grew larger and more destructive. Each subsequent landing carried forward knowledge paid for on a narrow strip of coral sand. Tarawa was taken in just over 3 days, but its meaning unfolded over years, written into doctrine, memory, and the understanding that victory in modern war is never clean, never quick, and never free. The island fell in 76 hours. The cost echoed far longer.